Hi everyone, my name's Kevin. This is my module for Module 5. There we go. Understanding my community. In terms, so I laid this out in a couple of different ways. I took some of the questions to mean things going on in my school, specifically just in the school community, and some of the questions I tackled from a neighborhood community. Um, so I'm a Chicago Public Schools teacher. The school that I teach at is a CPS school. It's a neighborhood school. What that means is that any kid who lives within the parameters or surrounding the school is allowed to come to the school. It's a little bit different than in, charters, magnets, selective enrollment high schools. So neighborhood school takes anyone who is geographically located near to the school. It serves a couple different neighborhoods, West Humboldt Park and Hermosa. The school physically is in Hermosa, so most of the data that I'm going to go over in the presentation is data that is for the neighborhood of Hermosa, which is a neighborhood on the northwest side of the city. So my school is 85% Hispanic and 15% African American. So not a lot of diversity. Many of the students are first generation Americans. Many of their parents are immigrants themselves. A lot of the parents of the students are also here illegally. So I think a lot of tension comes from that point of view as well. We also have a lot of refugees that come in and out of our school environment. A lot of during the recent earthquake in Puerto Rico, we found a really big swell of refugee students who were fleeing from the earthquake. Um, in terms of the building that the school is located on, the building opened in 2004, so it's a really new building. The first graduation took place in 2008, 4 years later. In 2004, we just had a freshman class and then kind of built it up until the first graduation in 2008. North Grand High School, that's the name of the school that I work at, has one of the highest graduation rates in the city and one of the highest college entrance rates in the city as well. Our school is also a really popular destination for kids in the neighborhood because it has an award-winning building. The complex has 7 different wings. It's over 200,000 square feet, 2 different floors, all new amenities. It's really a great building to work in. In terms of population, this is where I answered here mostly for the neighborhood in the city. Hermosa, it's predominantly Hispanic, predominantly blue collar. There's a lot of manufacturing that goes on in the neighborhood. There is a population in the neighborhood of around 25,000 people. That's per census data in 2010. Hispanic or Latino made up or comprised 90% of the population. So not a lot of diversity in the neighborhood. Most of the population are made up of residents from who can trace their roots to Mexico and Puerto Rico. 35% of residents are foreign born, and 20% of households in Hermosa live below the poverty line, which is right around the average for the city. In terms of how people get their news in the neighborhood, I mean, it's the same probably everywhere. Most people get their news from social media. There is still newspaper circulations, physical, actual newspaper. The biggest one in the city is Chicago Tribune. In terms of the school community, everything we do, every communication that we make to students, to parents, to the community is done twice. It's done in English and it's done in Spanish. Our website is in 2 different languages. Any newsletters that go home in 2 different languages. Phone calls home, we call them robocalls. So if we need to make an announcement when we call home, happens twice. Happens in English and it happens in Spanish. There are interpreters always ready in the main office, ready to talk to parents. I myself am a special education teacher, so in preparation for my IEP meetings, I need to know if an interpreter is needed for the meeting. So I ask the student, and I go based on um, older data, older IEP data, and a lot of times we need an interpreter because the parent of the student does not speak English. Community groups in the neighborhood. We have the Hermosa Neighborhood Organization. It's an advocacy group. It fights for the residents of the neighborhood. Better city services, better schools, cleaner, safer, more and better parks, and higher safety standards. United Neighbors in Action is also a local community group. It fights against an increase in subsidized housing in the neighborhood. It's kind of a pushback against gang activity in the neighborhood. The Kelvin Kelwell Community Organization and the Hermosa Community Organization are both groups that are created to combat crime in the neighborhood. And just to give you a good snapshot, I know it was in 1992, but 800 residents marched from Kelvin Park, which is a park in the neighborhood, to another park in the neighborhood to protest gangs in our community. As far as leadership in the community, Chicago is separated into a number of different wards, and each ward has an elected alderman. And aldermen are very, very powerful people in the neighborhoods. We ask a lot of things from our alderman in terms of school community relations. Our alderman is invited to meetups and school meetings. He's very active, he's very present, and a very integral person in our neighborhood. Our alderman is Gilbert Villejas. He's a progressive Democrat. He sits on the city council for the Latino caucus. So he himself is Hispanic, and he speaks and gives voice to Hispanics in the city. He is progressive, and he has been the author of laws that have been passed in the city for equality for women and for minorities. Gilbert Villegas is very accessible. I actually have a project that I do every year where students write a letter to their alderman. So every Columbus Day they write a letter either for or against the holiday, and we receive several replies from the alderman. So he is receiving these letters and he's replying. He accepts phone calls, letters, emails. There's a form on his website. If you need anything done, if you have any questions, if there needs to be any upkeep in the neighborhood, or you just want to speak to him about something, he's very accessible. He also encourages personal drop-ins into his office. And there's also a service tracker, so if you want to make a report or a request, you can track it on the website to see in what stage it is of being completed. So I would say that the alderman is very transparent and very accessible. In terms of economic conditions in the neighborhood, the median household income is pretty well below the median income of Chicago. We are still only about 20% below the poverty line, but I would characterize it as an underserved, poor neighborhood. 26% of households pay more than half of their income for housing, which is not good. But industry is big in the neighborhood. About a quarter of land use in the neighborhood is industrial. About 3/4 of all employment of people in the community comes from industry. There are around 2,500 jobs available in the manufacturing industry in the neighborhood alone, which is a ton of jobs. It's a big source of employment. About 15% of all employment is industrial. Also, in terms of economic housing, gentrification is starting to take root in our neighborhood. Home values are up around 33% in the past handful of years, and only look to continue to rise. Okay, so politically, my school is a CPS school. CPS is the fourth largest school district in the entire United States. So politics play a big part in my school. Our district serves around 400,000 kids. Our superintendent is our chief executive officer, and they are constantly in the news. The most recent CEO was Forrest Claypool. Just 2 weeks ago or so, he was forced to resign amid some allegations about some improper cover-up with one of his aides or something like that. So our current interim CEO is Jesse Ruiz. There is a lot of reporting that goes on about CPS and about our CEOs and the politics that surround them. And it's a big source of news, local news. CPS has a budget of around $5 billion. Around $2 billion comes from local city taxes, $1.5 billion from the state of Illinois, which is a large sticking point for people who live downstate, that a lot of their money comes up to Chicago to help fund Chicago public schools. And around $1 billion of our funding comes from the federal government. Per student spending in the year 2010, this is a little dated information, is around $13,000 per student. In terms of social tensions, there's a lot of social tensions in the neighborhood. It's an underprivileged, underserved, poor community made up of mostly minorities. So there's a lot of gang activity, and there's a good amount of crime, but that seems to be trending downwards lately. In 2012, there were around 5 or 6 violent crimes per 1,000 residents in our neighborhood, which has been steadily decreasing. Just to give you some reference points, it's a much lower crime rate than the neighboring Humboldt Park, which is directly to the south of us, which is about 15.5 violent crimes per 1,000. So that's significantly higher. And the Chicago number there is around 10 violent crimes per 1,000 residents. So we are much lower, but that is still a significant amount of crime. In terms of our social tensions in our school, there are racial cliques that sometimes present issues. I think a trip around the school, you can see that the school is pretty self-segregating, much like our city as a whole, which is not good. And I wish that there was some way that we could solve that. I'm just not sure. In terms of discrimination, it's everywhere in the city. Our school is segregated. Our city is very segregated. People of the same races tend to cluster and live around each other, and it certainly is a problem, and it certainly creates tensions. If you wanted extra information on the school, there's a couple things you could do. You could get school records by the office. You just walk in and they'll give them to you, or you can get them by request. We do give questionnaires to students. It's a 5 Essentials survey. It's a questionnaire about their school day, about how they perceive the school. I'll actually talk a little bit more in depth about the 5 Essentials survey a little bit later. There's a the CPS district website you can gain information on. There's